Um, we opened out of town. We went to San Bernardino.
Join us as we uncover the hidden story behind the awful ending and tragic death of Rock Hudson and his wife, the boy who learned silence. Roy Harold Scherer Jr. was born on November 17, 1925, in Winnetka, Illinois, long before anyone called him Rock Hudson. Winnetka was small and quiet, the kind of place where people noticed what you did and remembered it. The Great Depression hit families like Roy's hard. Money problems weren't just about not having enough. They changed the mood in the house. They changed how people talked to each other and how often they smiled. Roy's father struggled as an auto mechanic, and when things got worse, he left. That kind of disappearance doesn't just create an empty chair at the table. It creates a new rule in a child's mind. People can leave even if they're supposed to stay. That was Roy's first lesson in impermanence. One day, there's a father. Then there isn't. There's no big explanation that makes sense to a kid. Just the fact that the world can change suddenly, and you might not get a warning. When a child learns that early, they often stop expecting stability. They start measuring their words. They think before they speak, not because they're polite, but because they're trying not to make anything worse. Roy's mother had to survive. That kind of pressure can harden a person. She had bills, worry, and a life that didn't turn out the way she hoped. In homes like that, affection can become limited. Not always because a parent doesn't care, but because stress takes up all the space. Warmth turns into something you give only when there's enough energy left. Roy didn't grow up in a home where feelings were talked through carefully. He grew up in an emotional vacuum, where you learn to handle your fear and sadness on your own. At school, Roy stood out in a way that didn't help him. He was tall, and that made him noticeable even when he wanted to disappear. People could see him, but they didn't necessarily understand him. And because he had a stutter, speaking could be stressful. A stutter isn't just a speech issue. For a kid, it can feel like your own mouth won't cooperate when you need it to. It slows you down right when you want to fit in. It gives other kids time to interrupt, tease, or decide you're weak. Roy's school years were shaped more by observation than participation. Teachers noticed he didn't talk much, unless he had to. Other students noticed too. When a child is mocked for how they speak, they often speak less. They pick their moments carefully. They start living inside their head because their voice feels risky. The stutter likely became a social barrier, but it also became internal shame. Shame doesn't stay on the outside. It becomes a private feeling that follows you around. It tells you to be careful. It tells you not to draw attention. It tells you that being noticed will lead to pain. And there was another layer. Roy had an early awareness that he was different, but he didn't have words for it. In the 1930s and 1940s, especially in a small town, there wasn't a safe public language for questioning your identity or your feelings. A boy who noticed certain things, felt certain pulls, or looked at people in certain ways often learned quickly to keep that private. So Roy watched people. He studied them. He learned what got praised and what got punished. He learned what kind of boy was accepted and what kind wasn't. Movies became Roy's escape because they gave him something life didn't. They gave him a place to sit quietly and still feel something big. Going to the theater alone became a ritual. In the dark, he could watch without being watched. He could feel without explaining himself. He could imagine a different life without having to say it out loud. He wasn't just copying actors. It wasn't only imitation. It was aspiration. Roy wanted to be seen the way those men were seen. Cary Grant, Clark Gable, and Gary Cooper represented confidence, power, and permission. They moved through the world like they belonged there. They spoke without fear. They were admired openly. They were allowed to take up space. And once he finally left Winnetka behind, the next chapter is where Hollywood starts turning that quiet, guarded boy into someone the whole world can't stop staring at. Hollywood builds a man. When Roy Harold Scherer Jr. arrived in Los Angeles after World War II, he wasn't chasing fame with confidence or a clear plan. He was drifting. Like many young men who came out of the war years, he felt disconnected from where he had been and unsure of where he was going. He had served briefly in the Navy, but military life didn't give him purpose or direction. When he was discharged, he didn't return to Illinois with a sense of home. Instead, he carried a quiet restlessness and a belief that whatever his future was, it wasn't back there. Los Angeles promised reinvention, but Roy arrived with very little. He had no formal acting training, no industry connections, and no strong sense of self-worth. What he did have was his appearance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and striking in a way that made people look twice. That alone was enough to open a door. An agent noticed him and quickly summed him up. Roy was beautiful but passive. He didn't command a room. He didn't push his way forward. He waited. In Hollywood terms, he had potential but no agency. He didn't yet know how to use what he had, and more importantly, he didn't believe he was allowed to. Hollywood wasn't interested in who Roy was. It wasn't curious about his past, his fears, or his inner life. It saw him as raw material. The industry worked by identifying what could be sold and then shaping it until it fit a profitable image. Roy's face, body, and presence were valuable. His personality, uncertainty, and vulnerability were not. The first major step in Roy's transformation was his name. Roy Harold Scherer Jr. didn't sound like a leading man. It sounded ordinary, ethnic, and regional. So it was erased. In its place came Rock Hudson. The new name was strong, simple, and masculine. It suggested stability and power. Changing his name wasn't just a branding choice, it marked the beginning of leaving his old self behind. Once the name changed, everything else followed. Roy was put into training. He took voice lessons to deepen and steady his speech. His stutter, which had followed him since childhood, was treated as a defect. The goal wasn't to understand it or work gently with it. The goal was to eliminate it. Any hesitation or softness in his voice was drilled out. He was taught how to stand, how to walk, and how to hold his shoulders. He was corrected constantly. Masculinity, as Hollywood defined it, was something that had to be learned and enforced. He was told when to smile, when to lower his voice, and how to move in a way that looked confident. His natural awkwardness wasn't allowed. His uncertainty was seen as weakness. The first rule became clear very quickly. Uncertainty was forbidden. Rock Hudson could not hesitate. He could not appear unsure. He could not be confused, afraid, or searching. Those feelings didn't fit the image. If Roy had survived by being quiet and careful, Rock had to survive by being firm and controlled. Once Rock Hudson existed, the studios worked to maintain him. Control became a craft. Studio publicists monitored how he spoke in interviews. They shaped his answers, corrected his tone, and softened anything that felt too honest. His movement was watched. His behavior at parties was noted. His friendships were evaluated. Relationships were especially sensitive. Who he spent time with mattered. Who he was photographed with mattered even more. If a friendship raised questions, it was discouraged. If rumors appeared, they were managed. The goal was consistency. Rock Hudson had to appear reliable, predictable, and safe. Even his personal history was rewritten. Real memories were replaced with manufactured anecdotes. Stories about his childhood, his interests, and his values were cleaned up and simplified. Anything messy or painful was removed. The public didn't know Roy Scherer, the boy shaped by loss and silence. They knew Rock Hudson, a calm, confident man who seemed untouched by doubt. And once Hollywood finally decided the new version of him was ready, it put him on screen and watched to see if the world would believe the performance. Stardom. By the mid-1950s, Rock Hudson was no longer just a carefully trained actor with a good look. He was becoming a real star. But even as his career grew stronger and more respected, the gap between who he appeared to be and who he actually was continued to widen. His fame gave him attention, praise, and power in Hollywood, but it never gave him ownership over his own life. In 1954, Rock Hudson starred in Magnificent Obsession, a role that changed how people saw him. Before this film, many critics viewed him as a handsome presence rather than a serious actor. He was admired, but not always taken seriously. Magnificent Obsession challenged that view. Hudson played a reckless man who goes through a spiritual transformation after causing harm to others. The character grows, becomes more thoughtful, and learns to care deeply. Audiences were surprised. Critics were surprised too. For the first time, Hudson was praised not just for how he looked, but for what he could express emotionally on screen. This marked a shift from spectacle to credibility. He was no longer just a studio-built image. He was now seen as someone capable of depth. Hollywood took notice, and so did audiences. The film made money, but more importantly, it made Hudson believable as a leading man with emotional weight. There was irony in this success. On screen, Hudson played someone who found meaning through honesty and inner change. Off-screen, he was hiding major parts of himself every day. He was praised for portraying spiritual redemption while being denied the freedom to live truthfully. The more the public believed in his emotional sincerity, the more pressure he felt to maintain the lie behind it. A year later, Hudson starred in All That Heaven Allows, a film that pushed his heartthrob status even further. He played a younger man who falls in love with an older widow, a relationship judged harshly by society. The film focused on social rejection, emotional isolation, and the pain of being told your love is unacceptable. For Hudson, the parallels were impossible to miss. On screen, he was part of a love story that faced public judgment and quiet cruelty. Off-screen, he lived a life where love had to be hidden completely. The difference was that audiences were encouraged to sympathize with his character while never realizing how closely that pain mirrored his own reality. The film made women swoon, and critics praised his sensitivity. He became an object of romantic idolatry. Fans wrote letters, sent gifts, and imagined lives with him. His image as a romantic ideal grew stronger with each role. But that image came with strict limits. Romantic freedom existed only on screen. Off-screen, he couldn't openly love anyone who mattered most to him. Public appearances were carefully managed. Dates were staged or discouraged. The same industry that sold his image as a symbol of love also worked tirelessly to prevent him from expressing real love. In 1956, Hudson reached a new level of fame with Giant, a sweeping epic that placed him alongside Elizabeth Taylor and James Dean. The film was a major cultural event. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a statement about American identity, power, and masculinity. Hudson played a Texas rancher who embodied strength, authority, and tradition. The role cemented his image as the ideal American man, tall, commanding, confident. The performance earned him his only Academy Award nomination, a moment that symbolized his full arrival as a Hollywood heavyweight. Around this time, magazines began calling him the most handsome man in the world. His face appeared everywhere. Fan clubs exploded. Women of all ages admired him openly. Studios saw him as reliable and profitable. He had become an archetype. But becoming an archetype came with a burden. Archetypes don't get to be complicated. They don't get to doubt themselves or change too much. Once Hudson became the symbol of American masculinity, there was even less room for him to exist as anything else. Fame amplified his isolation. The more famous he became, the more carefully he had to live. Every movement mattered. Every rumor mattered. Privacy shrank as admiration grew. He was surrounded by people, yet deeply alone. And as his fame reached its peak, the pressure to keep pretending only grew, setting the stage for the most painful parts of his private life: the off-camera performance. By the late 1950s, Rock Hudson had mastered the performance everyone could see. What fewer people understood was that the harder role came after the cameras stopped rolling. Off-screen, his life required just as much control, rehearsal, and silence as any film. Fame didn't free him. It placed him under constant watch. Rumors followed Rock Hudson almost as closely as praise. Hollywood had always been a place where secrets traveled fast, and when someone as famous as Hudson moved through that world, people noticed everything. Studio executives were especially sensitive to gossip. His image was valuable, and anything that threatened it caused panic. The response was swift and organized. Studios employed fixers whose job was to manage risk. If a rumor appeared in a gossip column, it was shut down. If a journalist asked the wrong question, access disappeared. If a photograph felt questionable, it was buried. The machinery of suppression worked quietly, but constantly. In 1955, Hudson married Phyllis Gates, his studio secretary. On paper, it looked like a perfect solution. The marriage would quiet rumors and reassure the public. For the studio, it was a strategy. For Hudson, it was another role he didn't feel allowed to refuse. The marriage was never built on romance or shared vision. It was designed to serve a purpose. Gates later said she did not know Hudson was gay when they married, though many have questioned how much was understood on both sides. What is clear is that the marriage lacked honesty from the start. At some point, the truth pushed its way into the open. In a private confrontation recorded on tape, Gates asked Hudson why he couldn't admit who he was. The question wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It cut straight to the center of his life. Hudson didn't respond with anger or denial. He responded with silence. Silence had always been his default defense. When words felt too dangerous, he withdrew. That pattern followed him everywhere. Silence kept him safe, but it also kept him alone. The marriage didn't last long. The divorce came quietly, without scandal or spectacle. But it wasn't closure. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the strategy hadn't worked. Confirmation that no amount of performance could resolve the conflict between his public image and private truth. Over time, Hudson's relationships became fragmented. There were moments of closeness, but rarely continuity. Time together had to be planned, hidden, and limited. Emotional connection existed in intervals rather than stability. This created exhaustion. Living with double consciousness means always tracking two versions of yourself, the public one and the private one. What you say and what you mean, who you are with and who you claim to be. It requires constant correction. And while he kept everything together in public, one private relationship would quietly change him in ways no studio could control. The love he could not claim. For all the control surrounding his public life, Rock Hudson experienced one private relationship that stood apart from the rest. It wasn't the longest, and it wasn't the safest, but it was the one that mattered most. It was the love he never spoke about in interviews, never hinted at in public, and never allowed to have a future. It was also the love that quietly stayed with him for the rest of his life. They met in spaces designed for privacy, private parties behind gates, living rooms where curtains stayed drawn, rooms where voices stayed low, and names were rarely spoken too loudly. Hollywood had places like that, and men like Rock learned early where they could exist without being watched. The man was also an actor, though less famous. He was confident in ways Rock wasn't. He spoke freely, laughed easily, and didn't flinch at his own truth. Where Rock had learned to pull inward, this man moved outward. That difference drew them together. For Rock, the relationship was rare because it offered something he almost never had: the experience of being known, not admired, not desired, not managed, known. This man saw past the image and didn't seem impressed by it. He knew Roy, even if the world only saw Rock. Their time together wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and intentional. Weekend trips away from Los Angeles, shared hideaways where they didn't have to perform, handwritten notes left behind instead of phone calls, long stretches of silence that didn't feel uncomfortable, silence that didn't demand explanation. Those moments mattered because they didn't require defense. Rock didn't have to explain himself. He didn't have to correct his voice or posture. He didn't have to track who might be listening. For someone who lived under constant surveillance, that kind of peace was powerful. But the relationship had no protection. There was no way to acknowledge it publicly, no way to build a shared life without risk. Every moment existed under the threat of discovery. Friends noticed. Studio executives noticed. Warnings were delivered quietly but clearly. Rock was told he was too valuable to lose. At some point, the relationship reached a breaking point, not through anger or betrayal, but through honesty. After a few drinks, during a moment that felt safe, his partner asked a simple question: "Would you ever marry me?" It wasn't meant as a demand. It wasn't dramatic. It was a question about possibility, about whether love could exist outside hiding. For Rock, the question landed like a threat to everything he had built. Marriage wasn't just a personal choice. It was impossible within the world he lived in. He couldn't even say this man's name out loud in public. He couldn't acknowledge the relationship to anyone who mattered professionally. The question forced him to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't change the subject. He paused. Then he answered honestly. He said he couldn't even say his name, and that made marriage unthinkable. That answer wasn't rejection. It was a confession. It admitted fear, limitation, and defeat all at once. It admitted that no matter how real the love was, Rock couldn't fight for it. The system had shaped him too completely. The relationship didn't end with a fight. There was no dramatic goodbye. It faded slowly. They saw each other less. Schedules became harder to align. Excuses replaced plans. The man moved forward with his life. Rock buried himself in work. As his career rose, his emotional world narrowed. Film after film demanded his full attention. Fame required constant presence. The busier he became, the easier it was to avoid the pain of loss. Work became a way to not feel. They didn't erase each other completely. Memories remained. Photographs remained. Years later, a friend once found Rock looking at an old black and white photo. It showed two men on a beach, relaxed and unguarded. When asked who it was, Rock didn't answer directly. He smiled, put the photo away, and said, "No one you'd know." That sentence carried decades of meaning. It protected the past. It honored it quietly. It also admitted that the love existed only in memory. And years later, when illness forced him to slow down, that old love would return in a way he never expected. Illness as revelation. By the early 1980s, Rock Hudson had spent decades controlling what the public could know about him. He had learned how to stay calm under pressure, how to smile through questions, and how to keep his private life sealed off. But then his body started to change in ways that couldn't be managed with publicity plans or careful silence. What happened next wasn't just a health crisis. It became a turning point where the truth he had spent years keeping hidden began to surface, whether he wanted it to or not. At first, the signs were easier to explain away. Fatigue could be blamed on work. A cough could be blamed on a cold. Weight loss could be blamed on stress or long hours. For someone like Hudson, denial wasn't just a personal habit. It had been trained into him. His career had taught him to keep moving, to not draw attention to weakness, and to treat problems as something to handle quietly. So in the beginning, he likely tried to rationalize what was happening. He could tell himself he was overworked. He could tell himself it was pneumonia. He could tell himself it would pass. In Hollywood, actors are expected to look strong even when they aren't. Hudson had done that for years with his personal life. Now he tried to do it with his health, but the symptoms didn't go away. They piled up. He grew more visibly thin. His face changed. His energy dropped. Friends noticed. People on sets noticed. At a certain point, it became impossible to pretend nothing was wrong. Doctors began to run tests, and Hudson had to face the reality he feared. When the diagnosis came, it wasn't shock in the way people imagine shock. It was confirmation. By that time, AIDS was already spreading through communities, and fear was growing fast. There was no clear cure. There was no easy treatment. And for a gay man in the public eye, the diagnosis carried a second threat: exposure. Hudson understood immediately what it meant. Not just medically, but socially. It meant scrutiny. It meant questions. It meant that the public might finally learn what the studios had worked so hard to keep hidden. It meant that the version of him the world believed in could collapse. After the diagnosis, he began to withdraw. Some of that withdrawal was physical. He was sick, tired, and often in pain. But much of it was emotional and protective. He pulled back from public appearances. He reduced contact with people who might talk. He tried to control the flow of information. In his mind, privacy was still the only safety he had. Even as Hudson tried to keep things quiet, a major moment was already set in motion. His appearance on Dynasty. The show was popular and watched by millions. When Hudson appeared and shared an on-screen kiss with Linda Evans, it became a big pop culture moment. On its own, it was just television. But after his illness became public, that kiss took on a different meaning. Suddenly, people looked back at the scene with fear. Not because of anything Hudson did wrong, but because AIDS was being treated like a mystery threat. Many Americans didn't understand how the disease spread. They didn't understand what was safe and what wasn't. So the kiss became a headline. It became a talking point. It became a symbol that people used to express anxiety. That moment reframed the nation's fear. Instead of AIDS being something distant that many people ignored, It was now tied to a familiar face. Hudson wasn't just a celebrity. He was a long-standing symbol of romance and traditional masculinity to many viewers. The public had spent decades being told he was a certain kind of man. Now they had to confront a contradiction they didn't want to face. Some people responded with compassion. Others responded with anger or disgust. Some felt betrayed, as if an actor's private life had been a promise made to strangers. That reaction showed how deeply the studio system had shaped public expectations. People weren't just reacting to Hudson, they were reacting to the myth they had been sold, dying without being known. Rock Hudson died on October 2, 1985, and even that moment, which could have become a huge public event, was handled in a quiet and controlled way. For someone who had lived most of his adult life in the spotlight, the ending was surprisingly small. That wasn't an accident. It fit the pattern of how he had survived for decades. Keep things contained, keep them private, and avoid giving the public more access than necessary. His funeral was modest. There was no red carpet, no cameras lined up outside, and no big public ceremony designed for headlines. In another celebrity death, especially in Hollywood, you might expect crowds, speeches, and public mourning. With Rock, it wasn't like that. The tone was restrained, and that restraint felt intentional. By that time, his illness had already turned parts of his life into a public debate. A quiet funeral was one way to take back a little control. The people who attended mattered, but so did the people who didn't. Absences can carry meaning, especially when someone has lived inside a carefully managed image. Some friends were present and grieving privately. Elizabeth Taylor was among those who mourned deeply. Other major people from his life were missing. Doris Day, a longtime friend and co-star, did not attend. She later said she preferred to remember him laughing, which suggests the funeral was too painful or perhaps too public in a way she didn't want. Those absences spoke loudly because Rock's relationships had always been complicated by secrecy and distance. Some people stayed close, others backed away. Some couldn't handle the sadness. Some may have been afraid of the attention. Some may have been protecting their own image, just as the studio system had protected Rock's image for years. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel,